In this video, we are going to look at trig equations, but we're going to add something from what we looked at with trig equations previously. So to get us started, let's look at where we were previously looking at trig equations. Previously, we would look at something like cosine equals negative square root of 2 over 2, and we would be looking on 0 to 360, so that's in degrees, that is on our unit circle. So negative square root of 2 over 2 would be here and down here. So our two answers would be 135 and 225. So that is what we did in the last section. What we want to add this time, the new part to this, is we want to say, let's find all solutions. Not just on the unit circle, but all solutions. Now, we're going to start by doing the same thing we did on the unit circle. So we're going to go back to the unit circle and say, where is my y coordinate equal to 1/2? And I'm going to get 30 and 150. So I'd have my two answers would be 30 and 150. However, we're not done yet. This is what we did previously. And if you think about that, those are our two answers on the unit circle. But we want to find all solutions. So if we go back to our graph of sine, you will remember that there is a lot more than two answers because of our sine curve. Now, we have these 2 points here. Let me move down our line. So here is 1/2. And we have our 2 points here that are our two values from our unit circle. This value here is 30. This value here is 150. So we're not going to need to do this graph every time. I just want you to visualize it here the first time. So those are our two values that are on 0 to 360 or 0 to 2 pi, this one period that we always look at. However, as you look at this graph, there are other points where it is also equal to 1/2. Now, and there's even more that go past this graph, continues to the left and the right. But you'll notice if we look at the 30 and we go one period forward, so whether it's 2 pi or 360, if you're in radians or you're in degrees, either way, you'll notice you'll get another solution. So this answer right here would be 390. If you go another 360 forward, or 2 pi, you get this answer up here, which is 750. So all we're doing to get our next answer is we are just adding 360. We could also go the other way. I could go back from 30, and I could subtract 360, and I'm going to get another answer back there, which I can't see, which is negative 330. So once I get my first answer of 30, I can get all infinite other solutions by adding or subtracting 360. Now, but I also need to do that from 150 to get all infinite solutions. So how we're going to do this is we are first going to find our two solutions on our unit circle. So this is building off exactly what we did last time. But then what we're going to add is we are going to add 360n. And if you remember, just like when we did this before, this n is, excuse me, this should be plus or minus 360n. Where this n, like we did with sequences, is just going to be our positive integers. Okay. So our positive numbers starting with 0. So our n just represents, and we don't need to write this down, but this is just to refresh our memory. This n is just going to represent these positive numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So n, if you think about it, and we're not going to write this down, as we go forward, this is our answer. But when you think about it, you could have 30 when n is 0. If n is 1, that would be 390. If n is negative 1, that is negative 330. N is 2, that would be 7, and so forth. So this is a way that as n just continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger, that this gives you all infinite solutions. And like I said, we're never going to write this down. This right here is our answer. Let's look at another one. Cosine is square root of 3. Now, first off, if you remember from what we did last time with cosine, to be able to get, tangent, to get tangent as square root of 3, this has to be square root of 3 over 2 over 1/2. That's the only way to get square root of 3 is the 2's cancel. This is y over x. So I want to look, where is my y square root of 3 over 2, and where is my x 1/2? And I have 4 points. But this is positive, so that means either both points have to be positive or both have to be negative so that they cancel. So once we figure that, and really this is no different than what we did before, we get 60 and we get 240. Then what we're going to do is add and subtract 360n, and that is going to represent all of our answers. Now, tangent is a little different. We could actually change this up a little bit for tangent, and this only works for tangent or cotangent. If you notice that our two solutions are kind of opposite from each other. They're 180 apart. So with tangent, you actually could write this as 360 plus or minus 180n, because if I go halfway around the circle, that gets me to the next answer. Halfway around gets me to the other answer. Halfway around, that gets me to the other answer. Easiest way to do that is just to still do it just like we did with sine. But tangent's a little special because of the way it works out, and we get that answer right there. Either one is fine. Now, what happens if we change this to radians? If we change this to radians, all that's going to change is one, our first two answers. So cosine is square root of 3 over 2. That's going to be 30 and 330, but we're in radians. So we have pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6. And now what's going to be different is we're going to add and subtract not 360, but since we're in radians, we're going to add and subtract 2 pi n. And there are our two answers. So it works just the same way, except we are now using 2 pi n instead of 360n. Let's look at a few more examples here that are maybe a little step up from some of the ones we've looked at before, but require us to do a little bit more algebra to get there. So first off, notice it's secant. So whenever we get to the end, we're going to have to flip this one. But the first thing we want to do is we want to get the trig function by itself on one side. So this is going to be secant squared is 4/3. Subtract the 4, we divide by 3. Then we flip it, like we looked at last time, to get this to be 3/4. Now remember, every answer we get is always going to be something on our unit circle. So the last step is I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And the square root of 3 is just the square root of 3. The square root of 4 on the bottom is 2. And then remember, and here's the step that people always forget. When you take the square root of both sides of an equation, you need plus or minus. So we now end up with cosine of x equals plus or minus square root of 3 over 2. Now you'll notice again, we've gone back to, is these harder ones here, we go back to the 0 to 360, so we're just looking on the unit circle. So now what we're looking at is where on the unit circle is cosine square root of 3 over 2 that's positive or negative. So if you're looking at where's your x value, square root of 3 over 2, we have 30, 150, 210, and 330. So when you have these where you have things that are squared, you can get multiple answers. And when you do plus or minus, you actually can get up to 4 answers. Now, it's not always 4, but you could get possibly 4 when you do plus or minus. So remember, when you take the square root of both sides, you got to have this plus or minus. Now, the next thing I want to look at is I want to look at a couple problems where we have to do some algebra to kind of solve. So here is our next problem. Now, before we do this problem, let me go back and look at a separate problem, an easier problem from algebra. If you remember, if we solved this kind of problem, 2x squared minus x. And if I would solve that, I would factor it. I'd factor out the x, I get 2x minus 1, and then I get x equals 0, 2x minus 1 equals 0, and so I get 0 and 1/2 by factoring. So I'm going to use this same thing with cosine. But instead of 2x, I have 2 cosine. So I'm going to factor this the same way. I'm going to factor out the cosine. So hopefully you can see I've done just like x, but now with cosine. Now I have cosine of x equals 1/2, and cosine of x, equals 0, just like I did over here. But instead of x, I have cosine. Now here I can solve for cosine, and what I end up with is 2 equations. So now I can solve where is cosine equal to 0. And cosine is equal to 0 at 90 and 270. And then where is cosine equal to 1/2? And I get 60 and 300. So once again, I have 4 solutions because I had to split it into 2. So another one. Secant squared minus secant minus 2. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to think about this in terms of this being x squared minus x minus 2 is 0. And we're going to factor it like we did back with quadratics since Algebra 1 days. We're going to get x minus 2, x plus 1. But now with secant just replaces where the x's are. So I get secant of x minus 2, secant of x plus 1. So now my 2 equations are secant of x minus 2 is 0, secant of x plus 1 is 0. And at this point, this just goes back to all those other problems we've looked at since last time, where you have to get your trig function by itself. You need to flip it on both sides to get our answers. And now you end up with just the trig function equals something from the unit circle. So we can solve that and we get 60, 300, and 180. Notice here we only got 3 answers, not 4, based on the numbers. So some of these harder problems, we're just going to be using those algebra skills that you've already learned, that we've done previously to factor something, but you end up at this same spot where you have a trig function equals some number. Let's look at one last one. Go back and try to remember logarithms here. Log base 2 is cosecant. So we're going to write this in exponential form, which would be cosecant 2 to the 1/2 power. Now, if you remember, the 1/2 power means square root. If we flip both sides, we get 1 over the square root of 2. And remember, when we do these, we should always get values that are on your unit circle. That kind of helps you to make sure you're doing it correctly. So we need to kind of put this in a different form here. They rationalized the denominator when we did this. So 1 over the square root of 2 is the same as the square root of 2 over 2. So you can see we're now to sine of x is square root of 2 over 2. And so from our unit circle, that's 45 and 135. So as you look at the problems we looked at today, some of the harder problems where you have to use a little bit more algebra are just on 0 to 360. Just solve them on the unit circle because you're going to require to use a logarithm, to factor, to try to solve those. When we look at the problems where we want to find all solutions, whether it be in radians or in degrees, that's when you're going to have to add this plus or minus 360n or plus or minus 2 pi n if you're in radians. All right, you are now able to do homework over Trig Equations 2.